Our winner is Nick Lewis.
So it took a little longer. Oh well.
We're going to ask you. You left your email in there, I think. So. Oh, I need the battery. Any videos?
Mm-mm.
All right, you got hold on.
Yeah.
And that's
It's on?
on.
Yeah.
Good to go. That's your water or not?
Yep, my water.
And you can go ahead and.
Okay. Okay, Steve started my timer, so I have to start talking now. Thanks, you guys, for sticking around till the very, very end. I hope that this is a good last hour for you. I will say I was given this topic, gut health, by Ada County Medical Society. And I think talking about gut health is sort of like talking about world peace. There's no right answer. This is going to be really difficult to condense into a 1-hour talk. I went down so many rabbit holes trying to work in this talk. And if you came here to learn about what to do to have a healthy gut, spoiler alert, I don't really know, but we're gonna learn a lot over the next hour, and I'm hoping that you take some good pearls away from this talk. So I am an IBDologist, and so I will say that I'm gonna approach gut health by what I know best, which is what an unhealthy gut is. So we're actually gonna kind of start with the IBD side, and then it will be a totally different talk. It's not a repeat of the first one. And then we're gonna kind of talk about, well, if this is an unhealthy gut, then what is a healthy gut, okay? A wise man once said, all disease begins in the gut. I am biased, right? So I think that the GI tract is the most important organ in the body. And I think that you will be influenced by the end of this hour into thinking that perhaps the gut is more important than you initially thought. Okay, so what is a healthy gut? This is really a very recent idea, and the concept has been adopted by nutrition bloggers for many years, but it's been rarely used in the scientific literature, which is why developing a talk on gut health is especially difficult, because this has not been a mainstream or scientific issue until really recently. But some recent scientific publications have been aimed at defining dietary components that influence gut function and physiology. And those papers suggest that gut health is defined by the absence of GI symptoms and disease, as well as an absence of unfavorable local conditions. That sounds very generic, but that's what we've got as a definition for gut health. So let's go back to our colitis and Crohn's disease. These are models very clearly of an unhealthy gut, right? And so I'm going to try to kind of walk you through, well, what do we know that influences the development of an unhealthy gut, so that we can kind of walk it back and figure out what makes a healthy gut. Okay, so the term microbiome is going to be incredibly important over the next hour, and I'm going to try to convince you that it's really important for all of us to pay attention to, because microbiome dysbiosis has actually been described in all GI and liver diseases: inflammatory bowel disease, irritable bowel syndrome, primary sclerosing cholangitis. So all those things that I talked to you about in the first hour. We have studied these and found that there is a gut dysbiosis, so meaning a change in the bacterial composition of the bowel in patients who have these GI conditions. But whether the microbiome changes are cause, consequence, or incidental remains unclear. So this is the question, right? Is it the chicken or the egg? Do patients get this disease because their microbiome is abnormal, or is their microbiome influenced by the disease? In inflammatory bowel disease, we actually have several models that support the role of the microbiome in the pathogenesis of IBD. Animal studies and human studies have both looked at whether the microbiome might actually trigger or influence the risk of developing IBD, and the answer is yes. And I showed you this picture already, so we know that the microbiome is different between normal patients and patients with inflammatory bowel disease. We have more of the good bacteria in a normal patient and more pathogenic bacteria in patients who have inflammatory bowel disease. This study back in 2007 blew my mind. So again, I'm trying to show that the microbiome actually might trigger IBD, and this study actually did this. So basically, researchers took wild-type healthy mice, and then they looked at mice who were genetically designed basically to have colitis. So these were knockout colitis mice. They took the microbiome, they took basically a fecal transplant from the knockout colitis mice, and then they basically gave these healthy mice the fecal transplant from the unhealthy mice, and then the healthy mice got colitis. So for me, I was like, oh my gosh, this microbiome is actually important. And this concept really hasn't been around since, except for from 2001 on. So Joshua Lederberg in 2001 defined the microbiome as the ecological community of commensal, symbiotic, and pathogenic microorganisms that literally share our body space and have been all but ignored as determinants of health and disease. 2001. And if you look at the literature, investigating microbiome, it's like nothing, 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 nothing. 2001, we start to see this exponential rise in research that's been done on the microbiome, and it's just going to pick up. So what is the significance of all of the bugs that live in our GI tract? Well, we know that they shape the intestinal and systemic immune system. They maintain our healthy intestinal epithelium. They help us harvest energy from food, and they protect us against pathogens. So sounds pretty important. The microbiome is actually the largest organ in your body. So it is comprised of more than 100 trillion different microbial organisms, bacteria, fungi, viruses, and protozoa. There are actually more bacterial cells in your body than there are human cells. And so approximately roughly 40 trillion bacterial cells in your body, only 30 trillion human cells. The microbiome has more than 100 times more genes within it than you have in your body. And the majority of the intestinal bacteria are Firmicutes, Bacteroides, Proteobacteria, and Acetinobacteria. And as I told you before, in healthy adults, the Firmicutes and the Bacteroides are the predominant. So, I mean, I think it's pretty intuitive to think that what you have in your gut influences the health of your gut. But what we've learned in the last 5 to 10 years is that the effects of the microbiome extend well beyond your gut. I'm not going to go into a lot of depth or detail here, but I do just kind of want you to see what people are looking at. So studies examining the composition and the role of the microbiome have been uncovered to be associated with inflammatory skin conditions, autoimmune arthritis, type 2 diabetes, obesity, mental health, atherosclerosis, heart disease, the list goes on. Essentially, if you can find a disease, someone is researching whether it's related to your microbiome. So let's just talk about obesity. Obesity is one of these really well-studied conditions that may be related to gut dysbiosis. So there have been several studies that have basically looked at the microbiome between twins and found that in monozygotic twins, the microbiome is different, and it differs in terms of which gene is obese and which gene is thin. And again, like we talked about that microbiome being transferred via fecal transplant, this is another blew my mind kind of paper as well. So one study looked at basically taking the microbiome from an obese twin versus a thin twin, and then giving that microbiome to recipient mice, healthy recipient mice. And the recipient mouse who got the obese twins fecal transplant became obese, and the mouse that got the thin twins transplant stayed slender. So it's crazy, right? IBS. People have looked at IBS and gut dysbiosis, and have found that patients with IBS do have different microbiome. There's some conflicting literature about this. So some studies have not shown this association, but there does seem to be a change in the Firmicutes to Bacteroides ratio in IBS patients and a reduction in bacterial diversity. How about diabetes? Yes, we think that the microbiome is probably involved in diabetes. So one study looked at 33 infants that had a genetically high risk of developing type 1 diabetes. And what they saw was that if they looked at their stool test and the microbiome for the infants, the diversity of the microbiome dropped off suddenly before the onset of type 1 diabetes, and the levels of unhealthy bacterial species increased just before these infants developed type 1 diabetes. What about your brain? Yes, we think that the microbiome is involved in brain health. So certain species of bacteria in your gut actually produce neurotransmitters like serotonin. We all know that there's a very close gut-brain relationship. Not only just physically, there's a lot of nerves that run from your brain to your gut, but also these neurotransmitters that are made in your gut by these bacteria are going to have an influence on your brain. And just like in IBS, there does seem to be some thought that patients with various psychological disorders like depression, anxiety, have different species of bacteria in their gut compared to healthy controls. So that's just a sample, right? Like I said, any disease is basically being studied in terms of how is it influenced or related to the gut microbiome. How do we get our microbiome? So everyone sitting in this room has different microbiome. If we were genetically sequenced your microbiome, it would look different than the person sitting next to you. So we know that it starts very early. Actually, it starts at birth. So you begin to acquire your microbiome vertically from maternal transmission. So you basically pick up your mom's microbiome at the time of birth. What about genes? Well, genes do play a role, but it's small. So in twin studies, basically, we know that 8.8% of your microbiome is determined genetically. So it's a vast minority of your microbiome that's determined by your genes. Within the first few weeks of life, you'll start to develop your microbiome. It'll be basically complete by the age of 3. And after that, it's very difficult to change your microbiome. So basically what you get by 3 is what you have for the rest of your life. All right, so all right, so that was a rabbit hole too. I'm gonna stop right there. But yeah, it's very interesting stuff. So how do babies get their microbiome? Vaginal delivery, premature or delivery at term, breastfeeding, and then exposure to a variety of microorganisms. And so healthy microbiota, we think, and this has been extensively studied, is determined by whether you were delivered vaginally. That's pretends a more healthy microbiome, whether you made it to term, whether you were breastfed. So if you were born by C-section, prematurely, were fed formula milk, and you got antibiotics as a child, this has a negative impact on the diversity and composition of the microbiome of infants. And then the real big question is, what's the influence of diet on the microbiome? So I just told you that when you are 3 years old, you have your microbiome for life, right? So what good does it do to eat any differently? So the diet, we think, does play a significant role in shaping the microbiome. It's thought to explain about 50% of microbial variations in mice, but only about 20% in humans. And what we know is that an acute change in diet, so let's say you go from an animal-based diet to a plant-based diet, can alter the microbial composition within just 24 hours. But when you stop your diet, you revert back to what you had originally within 48 hours of discontinuation. These are small changes, though. They're not vast changes in your microbiome because, like I said, the majority is basically what you had by 3 years old. Okay, so what do we know about types of diet? Well, diversity is good, and it turns out that diversity is greatest in herbivores, and carnivores actually have the least amount of diversity. I'm going to go back to Crohn's and colitis, and I promise I'll bring it all together. But again, what do we know about why do patients get Crohn's and colitis? So patients who were born via C-section actually have an increased risk of early onset Crohn's. And patients that were breastfed, they had a decreased risk. So this was found to be protective. A little bit of controversy about this, but it seems to be replicated in studies that vaginal delivery reduces your risk, breastfeeding reduces your risk. So similar to what I just told you about developing a healthy microbiome. What about diet and inflammatory bowel disease? So increased risk for diets that are high in refined sugar. A diet that has high in complex carbohydrates reduces your risk. Fast food increases your risk. These are all just sort of, cross-sectional studies that have been done over the years in Crohn's and colitis. Coffee seems to be protective. Unpasteurized milk, protective. Processed meat, any meat. Sulfur, alcohol, all associated with flares. And in a nurse's health study, high dietary fiber reduced the risk of Crohn's disease by 40%. Okay, so why is this important? Well, I told you in the first hour that this seems to be a disease of industrialized nations, right? So the first case of ulcerative colitis was reported in 1859, and since then the rates have risen exponentially. Well, the first case of UC wasn't reported in China until 1956, and now guess what's happening, right? So industrialized countries sort of started the UC and Crohn's trend, and now these countries that are becoming industrialized are starting to develop rising rates of colitis and Crohn's disease. Okay, so what can we all do to improve our gut health? I'm going to go through some sort of like buzz topics that people are using, doing, reading, asking about, and we'll see if we can come up with some conclusions. Oh, probiotics, right? So that's a big one. People want to know, if I take probiotics, will it improve the health of my GI tract? So this is a little cartoon from the one probiotic that I actually use in my inflammatory bowel disease clinic. So this is VSL number 3. So what they're saying, what VSL number 3 is postulating is that bad bacteria can damage the intestines, causing irritation and reduced nutritional absorption. And VSL number 3 forms a barrier which protects the GI tract and allows nutrients to be absorbed. So this was actually proven to be effective in inducing remission in active ulcerative colitis in a review in 2017. And animal models have suggested that probiotics can help us promote the intestinal barrier. Probiotics have been effective in some studies to treat irritable bowel syndrome. But the take-home point about probiotics is they only work as long as you take them. So I usually tell my IBS patients, try it for 2 weeks. If it makes you feel better, great. If you don't feel any difference, it's not working and you don't need to take it. What about prebiotics? So this is a very, very busy slide, and I don't really want you to take much away from it, except that there's a lot in the prebiotic literature looking at basically how prebiotics help us synthesize short chain fatty acids. I'm going to talk a little bit more about short chain fatty acids, but these are basically like the holy grail of the bowel. So we want short chain fatty acids. They have a lot of benefits. They definitely decrease inflammation in the GI tract. And short chain fatty acids are found to be at very low levels in patients who have inflammatory bowel disease. So prebiotics, it's speculated, may help the bacteria in your bowel create short chain fatty acids. So prebiotics are selectively fermented ingredients that result in specific changes in the composition of the GI microbiome, conferring a benefit on the host. Animal models have shown enhanced mucosal integrity and reduced inflammatory cytokines, so reduced colitis. And the benefit, like I said, may be fermentation of the prebiotics in the gut by one species that provides a substrate for other species to help maintain healthy environment. I think there might be something going for prebiotics. So in a randomized placebo-controlled trial of infants with a parental history of atopy, researchers were able to show that formula milk supplemented with prebiotics significantly reduced the incidence of atopic dermatitis. This is also associated with a significantly increased number of bifidobacteria, no significant change in lactobacilli numbers, and it reduced the incidence of infectious episodes during the first 6 months of life. These researchers did not stop there. They followed these infants up to 5 years. So in a 2-year follow-up study of babies that got prebiotics in their formula milk, they found that these kids up to 2 years had a significantly lower incidence of allergic manifestations. And at 5 years, the prebiotic group had a lower incidence of any allergic manifestation, including atopic dermatitis, compared to the placebo group. And what they proposed was that the mechanism for long-lasting effect of prebiotics is immune modulation, mediated through changes in the intestinal microbiome. So we are really just starting to understand this. And most researchers will admit that an improved understanding of the functional ecology of the gut and a more detailed knowledge of gut metabolites are important for understanding the role of prebiotics on human health. And more studies on the effect of prebiotics on the health outcomes in humans are imperative. So I think the takeaway from this is stay tuned. It looks like there's something here, but we really need to look into it more. I am sure I'm going to make an enemy in this room because I'm positive that somebody here believes that leaky gut is a fact. And I'm not going to argue with you because in the GI world, we don't believe that it is. But I will just say that this has been studied really extensively. It was like a big thing between 1970 and 1990. What this term means is it's a simplistic term referring to intestinal permeability, because we know that microbial invasion, protection against microbial invasion is provided by the intestinal barrier. And so what if your barrier is leaky? We have a lot of lines of defense for microbial invasion, including commensal bacteria, so the good bacteria, the mucus layer in the gut endothelium with tight junctions. And the theory behind a leaky gut is that if you have underlying inflammation or even subclinical inflammation, that you might have expanded junctions between your cells in your GI tract that could lead to bacteria translocating and causing inflammation in your body. So in the GI literature, we don't support this, but when I get a lot of patients sent to my clinic with a referral from their dietitian or their naturopath because they have a diagnosis of leaky gut. So for sure, patients who have bowel inflammation, patients who have celiac disease, Crohn's disease, NSAID enteropathy, they have inflammation, they have breakdown of their mucosal barrier. I will completely get behind that they have a leaky gut because there's inflammation. But the importance or prevalence of a leaky gut and otherwise healthy appearing mucosa is controversial and unproven. So when patients get sent to my office with a diagnosis of leaky gut, I do not argue with them and I don't argue with the referring provider. I say, that's possible because, like I said at the beginning, there's so much that we don't understand about the gut and we're just really starting to get a hold of it. But what I do tell them is, I can't prove whether a leaky gut is real. It certainly could be, but let's figure out what's causing your symptoms and then we'll figure out how to treat you. Because there's a lot of other things that I do know exist that I can't treat. One of those things is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, so SIBO, and this is real. I'm going to walk you through what is it, how is it diagnosed, and how is it treated. So SIBO is the presence of excessive bacteria in the small intestine. It's frequently implicated as the cause of chronic diarrhea and malabsorption. Patients with SIBO may have unintentional weight loss, nutritional deficiencies, and osteoporosis. So this is just a quick chart that I made. It basically tells you what the differences are between a normal bowel and a patient who has small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. So in the small intestine, we should have a majority of gram-positive organisms. In patients with SIBO, they have altered bacterial composition with both gram-positive and gram-negative, and they have more bacteria than they should. So in a normal patient, an absolute number of organisms less than 10 to the third, so it's a relatively sterile environment compared to the colon. In a SIBO patient, this can exceed 10 to the 5th to 10 to the 6th organisms per mil. And the consequence, unfortunately, it's cut off at the bottom. But basically, when the increased number of bacteria and wrong bacteria metabolize bile salts, this leads to fat malabsorption and diarrhea. And when those same bacteria metabolize carbohydrates, it leads to bloating and increased gas production. So those are the hallmark symptoms of SIBO, right? Diarrhea, bloating, and increased gas. What are the risk factors for developing SIBO? There's a lot. Certainly anybody who has a structural or anatomic abnormality of the gut, so diverticulum, strictures, surgically created blind loops. We see this in Crohn's disease with fistula. We see it in motility disorders, so patients who have a slow gut or difficulty with malabsorption. Metabolic disorders, diabetes, hypochlorhydria. So we think about, gosh, somebody who's been on a long-term PPI, could they have SIBO? And recurrent antibiotics. And this picture is basically meant to show that in patients who have had Billroth-2 anastomosis or Roux-en-Y, they basically have a blind loop, and that gives the bowel an area that's not connected in continuity to harbor more bacteria and create this SIBO condition. Okay, so the gold standard for diagnosing SIBO is by a small bowel aspirate. This is the most direct method, using a catheter that's placed into the distal duodenum through an endoscope and then aspirating fluid for culture. There's a lot of cons, though, that go into this. It's difficult to arrange, and endoscopy is expensive. There's not a lot of risk with endoscopy, but it's measurable. Most of the bacteria that we're trying to isolate actually don't grow in routine culture media. Contamination in the endoscope and the catheter, so the rooms aren't sterile, right, when we bring these scopes in and out of the rooms. So the endoscope might be contaminated, there's difficulty aspirating enough fluid, and then prompt and proper specimen handling is really difficult. And so this is only done in academic centers that basically study exactly how to aspirate and culture the bacteria that they're looking for. It's not done in Boise, Idaho. It's actually really not done very much anymore because of all these problems. And so that's why the breath test was introduced. This is now the predominant method to evaluate patients for SIBO because it's cheap, for the most part, cheaper than an endoscopy. It's simple, it's safe, nothing's going inside the body, so not invasive. So this test relies on the recovery and quantification of an exhaled gas that's produced by the bacteria as they metabolize an ingested substrate. Those substrates are usually a readily metabolized carbohydrate, such as lactulose, glucose, sucrose, xylose. And this is now commercially available as a test to measure exhaled hydrogen or methane, and has led to the widespread use of breath testing for the diagnosis of SIBO. Sounds great, right? Well, this is what you would basically be looking for. So normal on the left and abnormal on the right. So basically, when you get an abnormal breath test, you see a rapid rise in the exhaled hydrogen and a higher than normal level. But here are the problems, and there are a lot. So there's no consensus about a gold standard. There's not a single substrate that has been identified as superior. We all have different bacteria flora, and so that can determine our response to breath testing. The optimum protocol is not known. Proper interpretation of the results in the setting of delayed or rapid gastric emptying can't help us make this diagnosis. And there are special populations who have had surgery that could require different standards. Recent antibiotic use could alter this, and the effects of H2 blockers and PPI may also alter the results. And of course, all of our patients are on H2 blockers and PPIs, right? So I don't do either. I don't do small bowel aspirate, and I don't do breath testing because of all of those inherent problems. But what I do is if I have a patient who has classic symptoms of SIBO and or risk factors, I treat them empirically with rifaximin. So this is a very safe antibiotic. Everyone's probably aware of it. It's used also for hepatic encephalopathy. And the upside is it's FDA approved for IBS with diarrhea. Great New England Journal article a few years ago that basically showed when compared to placebo, patients with IBSD got significant improvement on a 2-week trial of rifaximin. So even if it doesn't work for their SIBO, it might work for their IBSD. If you do a breath test and you find that it's methane predominant, there's a little bit of literature that maybe using neomycin plus rifaximin will get you a bit more bang for your buck. Alternative regimens that are not as effective and I do not use because of side effect profile are Bactrim, norfloxacin, Cipro, Metro, and tetracycline. So everybody here knows probably that a rifaximin is expensive. It's sometimes difficult to get approved by insurance. And so I'm often asked, what are the alternatives? Those are the alternatives, but I usually try to do something else with diet modification before I go to one of these alternate regimens, and that would be like the FODMAP diet. Okay, and then because these patients can malabsorb, it's important to look for micronutrient deficiencies and correct them if they are present. Okay. I have some closing thoughts, and bear with me because this might sound a little crazy, but if you haven't read this article in The Atlantic, it's not like it's mainstream, so it's probable that you haven't read this. This is a fascinating article, and I'm going to try to sort of bring it full circle with the gorillas. So this article, something mysterious is killing captive gorillas. For a decade, zookeepers have known that something strange was stopping the giant animals' hearts. Now they're beginning to trace the culprit to their guts. So interestingly, we really, have not had captive gorillas until the 19th century. The first gorilla came to the United States across the Atlantic from the French Congo in 1911. She lived for 2 weeks, fed solely on a diet of steak and hot restaurant meals. And they could not figure out why these gorillas kept dying in captivity. Finally realized actually gorillas are herbivores, right? So they were feeding them totally inappropriate meals. And actually into the 90s, the 1990s, zookeepers were still feeding gorillas meat, eggs, dairy, breads. So completely inappropriate and total lack of understanding of what these gorillas actually needed in their diet. So besides fibrosing cardiomyopathy, which is what the gorillas are dying of prematurely, guess what else gorillas get in captivity? Ulcerative colitis. So these things are not seen in the wild, ulcerative colitis in gorillas and fibrosing cardiomyopathy in gorillas. And so people are finally starting to say, what's different? What's different between captive gorillas and gorillas in the wild? So the Western lowland gorilla actually has a diet of about 100 to 150 grams of fiber a day. And I mean, I don't know if anybody in here tracks their fiber, but I track my patients' fiber all the time because we're Americans and we don't get enough of it, right? So the average, I would say, Idaho patient gets about 10. For real. And then you say, why don't you increase your fiber? Let's just try 20. And it's life-changing. So, so compare that to the fact that, these gorillas are getting 100 to 150 grams of fiber a day, just walking around eating grasses and other forms of fiber. So what we know about the lowland gorilla is that they actually have super high levels of short-chain fatty acids. They have this method called colonic salvage, where basically the bacteria in their gut is fermenting about 57% of their calories. And those short-chain fatty acids are thought to have a direct anti-inflammatory effect in the gut. So while I can't say for sure that the reason they're getting colitis in captivity is because they don't have enough fiber, it sure seems kind of suspicious. And so this high incidence of heart disease and ulcerative colitis in gorillas placed in captivity may have something to do with their gut. I mean, certainly, I'm sure that there are other factors as well, right? It's not very fun to be in captivity. They might have higher levels of stress, but again, the article from the Atlantic is pretty compelling. So let's talk about what is the sort of the human model of gorillas in the wild versus gorillas in captivity. So this is looking at a diet in rural Africa. This was published back in 2010, and they basically went, deep in the sticks, looking at rural African villages where basically they are making their own food from grains. It's very high in starch, fiber, and plant polysaccharides. The diet is predominantly vegetarian, very low in fat and animal protein. And then they compared the microbiome of those children to children in Italy of the same age. And not surprisingly, they found that the microbiomes were very, very different. And they actually found that there were higher levels of short-chain fatty acids in the children in rural Africa. And there were higher levels of pathogenic bacteria in the children living in Italy. So this is my final slide, and I will just say that a lot of this literature is found in not mainstream journals. So this is not being written about in gastroenterology and hepatology, but this is from the Journal of Translational Medicine, basically looking at patients who are on a plant protein diet versus patients who are on an animal protein diet. And what they found was that there was increased levels of bifidobacterium and lactobacillus, so the good bacteria, decreased levels of Bacteroides and Clostridium, the bad bacteria. There were increased levels of short-chain fatty acids in the plant protein patients. And what they found was that this increased T regulation proteins, decreased inflammation in the gut, and led to improved gut barrier. And what about patients on the animal protein diet? Increased levels of Bacteroides, Allostipes, Bilophila, Ruminococcus, all thought to be more pathogenic, and decreased levels of Bifidobacterium. They had lower levels of short-chain fatty acids. and TMAO, so basically an antioxide. And they postulated that these changes in bacteria, changes in dietary proteins, had a negative effect on cardiovascular disease and inflammatory bowel disease. Okay, so take-home messages. This is hard because I really want to send you home with some concrete data, and there isn't a lot. But what I will tell you is that we still don't know what constitutes a healthy gut. But because we have disease models of an unhealthy gut, we can try to start figuring out what are the differences between people who get diseases like ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease and people who don't. How are their guts different? We know that the microbiome is predominantly involved in gut health and has far-reaching implications for the entire body, and still learning so much more about that every day. We know that dietary diversity promotes the gut microbiome diversity, so the more diverse your bacteria is, the healthier your gut is. And that the best diet for a healthy gut is not known, but evolving research points to plant-based benefits over animal-based protein. Now, I'm not here to give you a lecture about diet, except that fiber is really important. And, but I can't tell you to eat a plant-based diet. I can say that it looks like there's research pointing to that may have health benefits, but there's a lot yet to be known. That's it.
Question. A patient of mine came in and she had read a book called Super Gut by William Davis. You probably know about that.
Yeah.
She said she's a very intelligent, high functioning woman, so it was like she probably has done a little bit of research. She came in and she said, I have been culturing my own yogurt after I've read this book, and I have no more sort of inflammatory arthritic kind of pain. I'm off Melexicam, et cetera, et cetera. So I read the book, which is a bit of a culture. But just your take on that whole idea of culturing some of these probiotics in yogurt for 30 hours.
Yeah, so that's basically the prebiotic part of this. So that's theoretically giving your body these fermentable substrates to promote healthy bacteria in the gut and increased short-chain fatty acids. So is it safe? Maybe, probably, if you follow the instructions and the rules about fermenting. People do this with kombucha, so also a prebiotic. I think they're onto something, but there's so much more investigation that needs to happen. So yeah, I mean, I would say if she feels better and it's not harmful, then go for it.
Have you read that book?
Haven't read the book, just familiar because I've had patients come in too. Yeah.
We have been using fecal transplant in the specific setting of C. colitis.
Yes.
So have they done any studies in which they have attempted fecal transplant to modify a lot of these factors that you've been talking about, and what are the outcomes?
So yeah, the answer is yes. There are studies looking at doing fecal transplants for some of these variety of conditions. And the good news is you can transplant the good stool into the bad colon. The bad news is that when they follow it out over time, basically the microbiome reverts. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Two questions. One, older women in particular who develop some GI distress and then they get this diagnosis of collagenous colitis. First question. Second question, a lot of recent articles I've been seeing about change in the gut flora for healthy aging, that the gut flora changes, that's part of the healthy aging, that when it doesn't change, not so healthy. Can you comment?
Okay. So let me do microscopic colitis first. That's an easier one. Microscopic colitis is something that I think of almost as IBD light. So there is inflammation, right? It looks normal when you do a colonoscopy, but then you take biopsies and there's either increased levels of lymphocytes, so lymphocytic colitis, or there's a layer of collagen just below the mucosa, and that's collagenous colitis. And you're right, it typically presents in older women. That's like the classic patient. Sometimes it can be brought on by medication. NSAID use is classic. Sometimes it's can be brought on by surgery. Orthopedic surgery is pretty classic for triggering collagenous colitis or lymphocytic colitis. So it's a really interesting disease. It's treated, first line therapy is actually Pepto-Bismol. So if you've got this lady comes into your clinic, she's having profuse diarrhea. This, by the way, is nocturnal bowel movements usually in weight loss. So it's not irritable bowel syndrome. And you have a high suspicion for collagenous colitis. There's no harm in starting her on Pepto-Bismol 3 times a day while she waits to get into the GI office. It can only be made, the diagnosis can only be made with a colonoscopy. So the second question about healthy aging and changes in the microbiome as we age. I don't know much about that. I haven't seen the articles that you're referencing, so I can't really comment intelligently. Yes. Oh, okay.
Thanks for your talk.
Yeah.
My main question is just about when you mentioned trying probiotics for someone who has IBS. I guess from what I've read before in just different review articles, it seems like there's not really a benefit to doing something like many more strains or, you know, to refrigerate them, that kind of thing. Maybe kind of good old fashioned bacillus, whatever you can get over the counter. Is that your agree with that?
That's my take as well. I don't think you should spend a ton of money on probiotics from the top shelf or the probiotics that have been refrigerated because there doesn't seem to be a significant benefit.
Two questions. The collagenous colitis topic. So you did say the most Pepto-Bismol, no risk that it would undermine your ability to do a colonoscopy against the GI.
Well, we are usually still able to see some of the inflammatory changes if it's been started, you know, within the last couple of weeks. If it's been months and they're feeling better and their colitis might actually have resolved with the Pepto-Bismol. So yeah, that's a good point. You could cloud the diagnosis if they've been on effective therapy. It's a minority of patients that respond to Pepto-Bismol, so it's less than 30%. I try it because it's cheap, but I only give it a week. If they haven't responded in a week, I take them off and then I put them on standard therapy, which is budesonide.
And how long do you often be on it?
Well, so my standard for budesonide is 3 months. I do a 3-month taper. So 9 milligrams for a month, 6 milligrams for a month, 3 milligrams for a month, and then I see if they can come off. And about 50% of patients can come off and stay off. And sometimes their collagenous colitis will, or their microscopic colitis will relapse and they have to do the therapy again. And I have some patients, I cannot get them off the budesonide. And so they're on the lowest dose that they can tolerate, which is sometimes 3 milligrams every other day. And we have the discussion about risks, benefits of low dose steroids and quality of life. And most of these patients are okay with the risks. They would rather have quality of life.
This is the same with lymphocytic colitis.
Yeah, so microscopic colitis is lymphocytic colitis and collagenous colitis, those two diagnoses.
Can you comment on the fiber a little bit more? You know, I spend a lot of time in most of the student counseling patients about high fiber foods and the benefits, and they look at me and this is America, a pill or supplement.
Right.
So, do you recommend for supplementation of fiber? Can you just go briefly into soluble, insoluble, and a particular fiber supplement that you feel are the most beneficial to food intake?
Yeah. So the fiber handout that I have in clinic is the handout that I give more than any other handout. So it is hard in America, I think, to convince people, number one, that they need more fiber, and number two, to actually get them to healthy levels. So it's different for men and women, and it's different by age. So we think that younger people need more fiber. So for women under age 50, about 20 grams a day. For men, it's about 30. And what I say is, here's a list of foods that have high fiber in them. See if you can incorporate this into your diet. And for patients who just want like a pill or something really easy, I tell them to eat a half a cup of Fiber One cereal every day and put it in a Ziploc bag, snack on it during your, whatever your daily activities are. And if you eat a half a cup of Fiber One cereal every day, that's 14 grams of fiber. If a scoop of Metamucil has 3. So it's, and that's the other thing, is that patients will often say, I get plenty of fiber because I take my Metamucil every day. Well, so that's only 3 grams, right? And I don't care if it's soluble or insoluble. They both do the same. They both have the same effect. And so I tell them whatever fiber you can get is good fiber. Yeah.
I've been trying to do more research on fiber benefits and reduction in colon cancer, and the literature is kind of all across the board, like the minimum is 30. There was one study that said for every 10 grams of fiber, you see a 10% reduction, so I'm like, I'll be 100%. So what is your recommendation to patients for the fiber supplementation for colon cancer reduction?
That's a good question. I don't know if there's a right answer. I think more is better, but can probably have side effects if you get to be too much, right? So patients who start supplementing with fiber will automatically notice that it makes them feel more bloated. So especially if you don't want to go from 0 to 100, right? So take it slow and try to be consistent. So if you have like 50 grams one day and 5 grams the next, it's not going to work as well. In terms of colon cancer reduction, there is an association between increased fiber and reduced colon cancer risk, but I think the studies, like you said, have been variable. So I don't give patients an absolute number. I say I want you to be within this range, and there's probably a benefit in terms of reduction of colon cancer risk.
Any other questions?
Please share your fiber handout. Yeah.
Oh, it's not something, yeah, I will, for sure, absolutely.
Okay, and our final winner is Becky Crow. So I'll hand it over to Steve.
Thank you, Dr. Evans. Thank you, Dr. Wheaton. Great presentations this morning. One more round of applause for them, please. So there are 2 evaluations to complete. One will be sent to you from Southwest Idaho AHAC about 11 o'clock or so. If you have comments about them, great. And if you did not yet log in with your phone, please check with me and Jennifer before you leave, because you need to do that by 11 a.m. The second evaluation is the one on the conference. You can leave your comments there about Southwest Idaho AHAC if you want to, as well as Shore Lodge and our performance. Happy birthday, Allie. We're not going to sing to you just for the sake of getting everyone on the road, but it popped up on my calendar, so I can't let it go. Alice, I have a card for you thanking you for your yoga instruction from people who participated, and we appreciate that every year. Next year, we will be on a different weekend than normal. They're moving us 1 week into basically February 29th through March 3rd, because McCall is moving the Winter Carnival from the beginning of February to the end of February, which means we'll be only a week after, and we'll actually maybe even see some of the sculptures at that point. So do stop by the lodge at the front desk and make your reservation under our group name for next year. You can always cancel it in the middle of January. They won't ding you, and we always look at that list to see that if you're on the list at Shore Lodge but you haven't registered with us yet, we're going to keep dinging you because we want the rooms if you're not going to be here for other people. So I think with that, at 11 o'clock when you get the email, or they'll keep emailing you, that's when you claim the number of credits that you were actually present for the Southwest Idaho AHAC, and that will show up on your CME certificate. I believe that is all. We want your feedback, what kind of topics and speakers you want to hear from. We had a great lineup this year. Let's keep that going. And Alice, yeah? Yeah, I'll be posting the videos probably early next week once I get back to the office and kind of edit out all the overall on the front and back end of all that. So I think that's it. Get on the road, get down the road before 1 p.m. according to the weather forecast. Thank you, drive safe. We appreciate all of you for being here. Is this your phone?